Hey, this is James from the flying-guillotine.com doing another video series on a director, and last time we did Bong Joon-ho, one of my favorite Korean directors, and this time I'm joined by another friend, Moon, and we're going to be going over a director called Im Sang-soo, and he is a very different director from Bong Joon-ho, and again, for this particular week we watched a film called A Good Lawyer's Wife, and we will be spoiling this film a lot. This is not a review, it is more of a discussion, so we're going to be discussing a lot of the themes, a little bit about Im Sang-soo himself, and just kind of generally going over the film. And so there will be spoilers aplenty. So, Moon, what were your initial thoughts on the film?
So this was my second time I've actually seen this film, and I think it's known, as you explained before, as part of the last of his sex trilogy. And from my memories from my first one, which I first watched, which I watched over a year ago, I didn't remember how much explicit sex scenes there was in it, but the main one that I still remember from a long time ago was that pretty much the final scene in the dance room on that rug where she ends up actually just crying, and that's kind of like her switchover moment.
Yep.
That's my most memorable scene. But I think the other things that I came away with after the second time going through it was just kind of how he plays with the characters a lot.
Yes.
How the husband starts out being this kind of bastard, cheating on his wife with this younger woman when he has a son, and he's off on a getaway with his mistress while his dad's in the hospital dying, and you're like, oh man, he's pretty much the worst type of guy out there. And then all of a sudden you come around and turn to end up pity him when he's just, in the bathroom by himself after a drunken night of karaokeing. And I feel like he was able to play with characters very well.
Yes. I think it has a really playful and free-flowing pace, especially at the beginning. A lot of the musical score kind of is very light and kind of pushes it just kind of lightly forwards. And I guess I have a slightly different feeling about the male character than yourself. I thought he was a very, very complex character. And, he cheats on his wife. He's an adulterer, no doubt. But he also makes a lot of ethical choices, and a lot of the film is about kind of the ethics about that character. Because he's a human rights lawyer. He, a very kind of conscious lawyer. Even in the scene where he kind of fudges the truth a little bit, where he gets in that car accident and he nicks the guy's bike as his car goes by, he still takes the guy to the hospital. Even though the character, the biker guy, is clearly at much more fault than the lawyer himself. But, I mean, he is maybe slightly at fault, but I would put most of the blame there on the biker.
I would actually say he was covering his ass doing that, because I'm not sure about the legal laws in Korea, but here, if a motorist, no matter what happened to the bicyclist, hits him, at least he'll have to come to court and figure it out. He didn't even want to go to court, want to bury it, so he made sure he got the blood test to show the other guy was drunk, and just write it off, and since he's the rich and powerful guy, expect that they walk off. So I feel like he, for that part, they were still showing that, and he also told his mistress to get out of the car, so he didn't want evidence.
He is definitely covering his own ass, but I felt like he probably would have been in even better shape if instead of stopping and letting the guy get up and getting to the hospital, he would have just hit the accelerator and left him. Because I really doubt the drunk guy could have seen his license plate or whatever, and of course he was drunk, so and it sounds like it was something like his fourth offense, so of course he wouldn't have known that at the time. So this is Im Sang-soo's third film. He was about 40 years old when he directed it. And so throughout his career, you can kind of see he relates, well, in this film in particular, the male protagonist is very much kind of a replacement for himself. And he kind of had a slightly intellectual upbringing. He went to one of the top universities in Korea, Yonsei, and he was just immediately got into film and kind of worked his way up. And so he kind of has a slightly intellectual vibe to him, and I think the character does as well. And the other interesting part is this film is a part of two different trilogies within Im Sang-soo's filmography. And so the first three films he did, Girls' Night Out, Tears, and A Good Lawyer's Wife, are all kind of a part of what he calls his sex trilogy. And these films, as Moon has said, have a lot of explicit sex, and sex is a very clear way that the characters express themselves. much to the dismay of some of our friends. But it's also, I think, really interesting because a lot of Asian cinema in general tends to be a little bit less explicit about sex than perhaps French film. And so it kind of has, in that sense, more of a European Western feel than kind of Korean, Japanese, East Asian film in general. And the other trilogy it's a part of is the historical trilogy. So this trilogy encompasses the director's third to fifth films. A Good Lawyer's Wife, President's Last Bang, which is a fantastic film. It's probably my favorite that covers the assassination of Park Chung-hee, which has taken on new historical significance now that his daughter has risen to power, and Old Garden, which is a little bit weaker than the previous two films, but it also covers kind of a political prisoner getting out of prison at that time. And we'll be covering that film in a couple weeks. But it's also a part of that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Im's family history. Im's grandfather fled to the north. They fled from the north along with his father, and you'll of course notice a clear parallel in the film if you watch it. And they left behind the grandmother and the 5 daughters, all of which they have only spoken of that they are dead. So, and this is apparently extremely common amongst kind of that generation of Koreans, where kind of the people that flee have had just such horrific experiences, and I'm kind of guessing at this point, but they've had kind of just such horrific experiences that they don't even want to talk about them, period. And it's kind of a blank black screen in kind of Korean history and in these family histories. And so in this film, you'll see that that's almost exactly the same case for the lawyer's father and grandfather. You'll see right when he's dying and he's kind of getting a little bit hysterical and delirious, the father breaks out into a North Korean song about Kim Song-hil. And this causes the lawyer to kind of re-examine his past a little bit, and he goes to try to find his grandfather, who's been living in kind of the remote countryside, and finds out that he is dead. And so in essence, that part of the family history has kind of been buried, and there's no kind of gaining that back.
I thought that it was also very interesting about the part in the hospital where the father is finally really dying from liver failure. I think another thing that brings up to the main husband character is that you see the sense of shame where he actually is trying to close the hospital door to hide that part, because it's also, as a second-generation Korean American, I'm not 100% sure, but at this point it looked like to me that just as a South Korean citizen, currently it is a shameful history to have a North Korean past instead of being purely having a pure family history from the South Korea. So, in another sense, it is interesting that he still does follow through his father's kind of dying wish to go to see his grandfather. And I think and right after that, you see that he essentially gets drunk, wakes up in some bar, and realizes he's pretty much in the pit. You know, he's bottomed out. And I think he's just realizing at that point that, you know, he's it. He's the last male line from his past. And I think that's very important for Korean culture. Yep. It's just to know that you are kind of the head of whatever is remaining of that family, yep, and kind of realizing how that family is falling apart.
And in essence, the bloodline was dead at that point because the son, who was still alive, was adopted.
Yes, yes.
Which is another interesting point. One of the central themes to the whole film is kind of what should be passed on generationally. And there's a lot of there's 4 different generations in this film. There's, of course, the grandfather, the father, and then there's the lawyer's generation, and then there's the sons. And a lot of it deals with just like what parts of our past should be passed on. In this case, the North Korean part, like Moon has said, has been kind of shameful, and it ends up not getting passed on to a certain degree. Another part that's also passed on, and this is definitely kind of a negative, and it's a theme that goes through this family as well as others, is alcoholism. And you can see that the father is dying from alcoholism, and you see him like spitting up blood, and it gets right on the guy's shirt. In essence, this is part of his legacy that he's also passing on to the lawyer. And throughout the film, even the father asks the son or the son's wife, has he been drinking a lot? And they're like, no, he's been working too much. But throughout the film, the rest of the film, we see that he does constantly drink and gets drunk, and it's just very consistent throughout the film. This is one of the bad things that's really passed on generation to generation in his family. Another interesting thing, and this kind of happens at the end, and this is kind of the very conclusion of the film, is the wife has the option of taking her husband back. He, in essence, gives her what might appear to be kind of just a very superficial move, because he clearly doesn't want to go back to her, and he might be trying to do what appears to be the very ethically conscious thing, but he offers to be a husband and to take care of her newborn son, or her son coming out, and she declines. In essence, she's cutting off the ties to that generation. Sometimes things should be cut off.
Yeah, I think a few other things that kind of brings up in this theme of generation to generation is you see actually his mom is super liberated. She's, become this all of a sudden feminist where she wants to live the life that she wants to. And you see that kind of passed on obviously to the wife, and she's liberated, not going back. So I feel you see that a lot in his later film, The Housemaid, of kind of this overarching feminist theme. Yeah. And I think, which I don't necessarily pick up in his other film, The President's Last Bang, as much, but I think he does that fairly well in a kind of an almost a non-typical way of, bringing in all this illicit sex, which is not normally shown as much in Asian cinema, as well as this kind of liberated feminine.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, Im shows you the kind of the slightly awkward sex parts of the characters first before you actually see the characters in kind of their more professional setting. Mm-hmm. For instance, the first shot you see of the grandma, or his mom, is her with a bra staring at the mirror with her lover, while her husband is basically on his deathbed. Mm-hmm. And we see the woman, Moon So-ri's character, first biking, followed by her teenage neighbor who pursues her. And we also see the lawyer with his mistress before we see him even with his wife. And another example, and this one's slightly tangential, is like when he's talking to the doctor, they first are like taking shots and drinking at a bar, and the doctor is sharing kind of this explicit sex scene. And then a couple scenes later, we see the doctor giving medical advice, which is kind of a strange inversion of how we think of it, because now we kind of see the doctor in his real light before we see him in his more professional setting, which really affects our perception of the characters. This being an Im Sang-soo film, it's also incredibly gorgeous. I haven't seen his first two films yet, which I plan to do very soon, but it has some really, really cool cinematography. The scene that Moon mentioned at the beginning, where she has sex with the teenager and kind of light is just coming into the dance studio, I think that's one of the most gorgeous. And he really just takes his time. There's a lot of long takes in the film, and it's just very, very patient with his cutting. And even, like for me, one of the most moving scenes is the scene that we see from afar after her son has died, and she's mountain climbing, and she's just like sitting there and crying, and we're watching through the bushes or the twigs or whatever, and there's like rain coming down, and I think that's really, really cool because he doesn't do kind of that standard close-up. In fact, you'll generally see that he tries to avoid that, especially in a situation so obvious as something like sadness and crying.
And you can kind of see how in this film he kind of plays a little bit with both like I really like little things like the curtains in their house when she's kind of dancing naked through the house, and just like the shadows, he's playing with that. In President's Last Bang, you'll see that he pretty much plays with shadows and kind of that heavy tone, versus The Housemaid is essentially like a color explosion. Yeah. And in this film, I really think he kind of used was exploring all aspects of that.
Yeah, and you'll see some really interesting filters, and I read a little bit about this. Like, during the scene where his son gets abducted, he has the whole thing under kind of a green filter, and the son is in a green jacket. And you'll see, and it's a really gorgeous shot where the son is just getting carried up there, and it's a really, really shocking moment once he just, like, flings him, and it's like,
unceremoniously.
Really? Yeah. There's no, it's kind of got this somewhat light tone up until that point, and then the film gets very, very serious, and you're like, holy shit, did that just actually happen? And that scene in particular is just kind of a standout within the film, in the sense that, and Im talks a little bit about this in some of the interviews with him, is that this is the center scene to the whole film. Before that and after that, there's not really a lot of events. It's very, very free-flowing. And this is the kind of the one set piece that just moves and changes the characters significantly. Like, even the father's death is somewhat expected because he's been sick, he's been drinking his entire life. Everyone knows that his death is kind of a inevitable thing, including the father himself.
Yeah, it's also kind of everything's followed a slightly logical pattern of how you think characters should act or develop, through affairs and whatnot even. But in this sense, the motorcycle delivery man, this was, really unexpected. He had no real logical reason to choose vengeance. It was kind of, he did it out of, he was at the end of his rope, so he just did this, and not really out of, like, a planned vengeance even. So I think this really was the tipping point where everything kind of followed this kind of logical, linear, or semi-linear pattern, and all of a sudden you go off the deep end, and things really start falling apart. Obviously, in the parents' lives as well.
And even the scene where you see the kid get abducted is kind of a weird, and you get the feeling that it's kind of this spontaneous, impulsive, drunken moment for the mailman who actually abducts and kills the son. And so it's just this matter of brief coincidence that really, that unfortunately puts the son into just great danger.
And I think this kind of brings us back to how he is able to play with characters and kind of make very awkward situations. Like we're kind of talking about earlier, how he makes the sex scenes really awkward, actually. Every single situation that he shows is not only explicit, but, everything, when the husband and wife, the lawyer and his wife are, in bed together, she can't come, so then that he's like, what the hell, why is this happening? And even with his mistress, they're all slightly awkward for the viewer, and I think he's uses that even just to give us, like, the sense of, even though they're showing
all his sex scenes are slightly off. They're slightly unusual. There's not really, like, one that you're, like, comfortable, okay, this is what's going on. I've seen this scene 100 times. They're all got this slight twist to it. Like, there's a teenager involved. The mistress is lying on his back, and I'm not even sure. But they're just, like, slightly off-putting, and he takes his time with them. These are not just, like, snap, bang, ha, 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 and you laugh it off. These scenes take their time, and he doesn't really cut a lot, and so we see these scenes, and we know we have to just sit in the awkwardness of these scenes.
And I think he uses that very well to kind of play with our perception of those characters. Instead of just they're happy going through their lives, there's obviously something off about their lives.
Yeah. And the film in general just has a really cool, I think, physical feeling. Of course, the sex, but even the wife dancing around. She mountain climbs, she bikes, she dances. She's a very, very physical, feminine being, and I just don't think you get those portrayals very often in cinema. And she's just a really dynamic character, and I think the actress Moon Sori does a very, very good job with her. And to shift gears a little bit, I thought one of the interesting parallels in the film is there are two basic deaths in the film, and they skip a generation. One is the adopted son, and the other one is the lawyer's father. And in one sense, the lawyer's father's death is expected, and we see it kind of coming, and the lawyer and his wife kind of are drawn closer together as a result of the death. The other death, the son's, pushes them apart. And we see almost from just the straight outset, they are not dealing with this together. They are dealing with it separately. And eventually this, pretty quickly, as a matter of fact, it leads to the end of the couple. And so, like, I thought one of the coolest scenes is where we see the husband naked, and it's amazing how often the husband was naked in this film. It must have been very awkward for the actor. But we see him, and he's crying, and the film is shot through kind of a glass window, and we see him crying in the shower, and then we see his wife walk into the background, and he immediately stops crying. And that just shows kind of their inability to deal with the incident together is kind of the demise of their marriage.
And I really like the other scene towards the end with the ice cream, where before her son died, she was in the bathtub and he was eating this tiny thing of ice cream, and they're all content. And then all this stuff happens. Her son dies, and she's essentially broken from this incident. And then at the very end, essentially after she comes back from the theater, she starts eating this popsicle, and then you can see that she's kind of whole again and returned to that kind of satisfied point in her life, whereas her husband is drunk again on the piano and playing that amazing background noiseless chord. And so I think where alcohol kind of plays this role of showing the lawyer's mentality, I think he also uses kind of different parallels with the wife, like the dancing and stuff like that. So
yeah, I agree. And so I think that about concludes it for this. I think it's I really like the film. I think it's a gorgeous film, and I think it really shows sex in a very stylish, but also a way that really moves these characters forward. So I'm excited to keep moving on along Im Sang-soo. Do you have any last thoughts?
No, I am really excited because my next few coming up are my favorite films from Korea in the last few years. So
yeah, so the next film we're going to watch is A President's Last Bang, which probably has some of the least sex of an Im Sang-soo film, but that doesn't mean there isn't any sex. It deals with the assassination of Park Chung-hee, but it also deals with human bodies, as does all Im Sang-soo films. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it's a fantastic film, and probably one of the most unique films, and most controversial,
yes.
From a very controversial director to begin with. So thanks for watching. Check us out at theflying-guillotine.com, and thank you.
Thanks.